Hello, and welcome to the April Research Information Volunteer Call on Improving Lives. Today's speakers are Jonathan Rosen, PhD, Director of Research, and Courtney Akafi, PhD, Senior Scientist, Research.
Hi, everyone. My name's Jonathan Rosen, and I'm a scientist here at JDRF. I'm really excited to tell you about all the fantastic work we're supporting in the Improving Lives program. By now, if you've been following the RIV series, you've heard about all of JDRF's work to identify people who have type 1 diabetes in the early stages of disease and to develop therapies that can halt the disease in its track, and even to invent new therapies, beta cells from a dish that could be transplanted into someone with type 1. What we're going to be talking about today is our efforts in improving lives to develop drugs, devices, and behavioral health interventions for people who have established type 1 diabetes. The good news is that we've come a long way in terms of care for people with type 1 compared to even just a few years ago. We have better glucose control and better outcomes from complications. However, we still have further to go. For many, if not most people with type 1 diabetes, glucose control is still a challenge. Broader metabolic control, meaning things besides glucose, like obesity and insulin resistance, are unaddressed by current therapies. And unfortunately, although the rate of complications is lower than it used to be, some people with type 1 will still develop disease of the eye, kidney, and heart. There's also clinical needs when it comes to mental health. People with type 1 diabetes are disproportionately affected by mental health issues, and this in turn affects outcomes like A1C. Additionally, even for people who don't have a diagnosed mental health issue, this disease just imposes a burden on everyone. It requires so much work, so much monitoring of insulin and diet and on. And this just takes a toll, and we're aware of that. Our goal is to develop drugs, devices, and behavioral health interventions that improve both clinical outcomes and reduce the burden of living with type 1. JDRF supports the development of therapies from start to finish. It's not enough to just fund grants and walk away. If you want a therapy to make it all the way to people, you start with discovery research. This is, the basic science, doing the lab work. Then you have to figure out how to get it into clinical trials. Then if it's successful in clinical trials, you need to take it to regulators like the FDA. Then if you get an approved drug, you still need to make sure that insurers will cover the drug or device, because if people can't afford it, then they can't use it. Then you have to make sure that people will actually use it, that doctors will prescribe it, and so on. And only then can you get to the real goal, which is better outcomes. If we're not getting all the way to the right side of this pipeline, then we're failing. JDRF has expertise in all of these areas in-house and in our network, and we bring all of this to bear to help move new therapies forward for type 1 diabetes. The Improving Lives program covers a broad swath of research. Again, the common theme is improving the health and quality of life of people with established type 1 diabetes. Today, we're going to tell you about the work we're doing with devices, with therapies for metabolic control, insulins and non-insulin drugs, new therapies for long-term complications, and approaches to improve the mental health of people with type 1 diabetes. We're going to start with our work on automated insulin delivery systems. An automated insulin delivery system means a CGM that talks to a pump which has an algorithm so that the system can give you the amount of insulin you need when you need it. Historically, we've called these artificial pancreas or AP systems, but now to align with what most of the field is saying, we're going to start saying AID as well. This slide shows several different AID systems which are approved for use either in the US or abroad. And JDRF had a critical role in developing things, which I'll tell you about now. In 2005, JDRF launched what was called the Artificial Pancreas Project. This was an all-hands-on-deck initiative to turn this sort of system into reality at a time when many didn't think it would be possible. We funded grants to develop algorithms, some of which have made it into the systems which are currently being used today. We forged a regulatory pathway in collaboration with regulators and companies. We made a roadmap for everyone to follow. We secured funding through our support of the Special Diabetes Program that supported pivotal trials, and so on. Also important here is that JDRF launched an initiative to make sure that people with type 1 would have user choice. All of the systems are great, but they're not all exactly the same. And we want to make sure that people would be able to pick their favorite CGM and their favorite pump and their favorite algorithm. Since we lost this work, the regulatory pathways have been forged, and there are now approved interoperable CGMs, pumps, and controllers or algorithms, which are again approved to be used with not just one other product, but multiples. It's been another big year in diabetes technology. Most recently, a new hybrid closed-loop system called Twist was approved, which uses the Tidepool Loop controller, which JDRF helps support. We also have recently approved the iLet from Beta Bionics, a new smaller insulin pump called Mobi from Tandem, and the Senseonics implantable CGM has been approved for 180-day use. This timeline shows just how much progress there's been in AID systems. In 2016, the first one was approved, and then just one after another since then. And we're excited to see what keeps coming next. This raises the question, now that we finally have a thriving market for AID systems, and that goal has been largely achieved, where does JDRF go from here in devices? Today, I'm going to tell you about the 3 areas that we're prioritizing now. The first one is CGM-CKM. This stands for Continuous Glucose Monitor, Continuous Ketone Monitor. We already have CGMs, like Abbott, like Dexcom, like others, but the goal is to add ketone monitoring to one of these. DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, is caused by an acute rise in ketones. And for that reason, if we had a CGM that could also continuously measure ketones, it could help you avoid DKA and a trip to the emergency room. Now I'm going to tell you about our work for what we call transformative new devices. We're no longer interested in developing another hybrid closed-loop system. We want to get things going for the future. Think of what the next generation of devices can hold. We've had some initiatives in what we call user-centric pumps, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And we're also interested in other transformational kinds of products. For example, a single wearable, which combined a pump for insulin administration and a CGM for glucose sensing. So you could wear just one device instead of 2. Finally, we're interested in developing AID systems, which offer increased automation around meals. In other words, moving past the hybrid closed-loop stage of development, which I'll also tell you more about. As I said, one type of transformational device we've been supporting is what we call user-centric pumps. User-centric means something that people with type 1 will want to use. So that pump won't be an irritating burden for people who don't like them. And it will also encourage more people to try pumps and AID systems in the first place. Recently, we launched a request for applications for the topic of user-centric insulin pumps. This is what we do at JDRF. We identify a problem that needs to be solved and solicit proposals for how to solve it. This is a slide I showed last year where I wrote projects coming soon. And I'm very excited now I can show you what we actually funded from this effort. We're supporting 2 different projects to develop extremely miniaturized pumps and accurate and affordable. One is from Dr. Penneter at UCSB, and one is from a new company called Teramix. What these projects have in common is the goal of developing an extremely miniaturized pump so that people with type 1 can have a pump which is smaller, more discreet, and generally more amenable to their lifestyles. We're also funding another project from a doctor named Manish Arora in the Indian Institute of Science, whose take on user-centric was to propose development of a pump which would be more affordable so that its uptake wouldn't be limited in the geography where he is. We're looking forward to seeing all of these projects progress as well as others which are developing transformational devices. Now to our third goal for AID systems, which is increased automation around meals. This means that you're using a new system and it's time for lunch and you don't need to count carbs, you don't need to calculate an insulin bolus, you don't even have to announce the meal. You just eat. You just go on with your day without worrying about your diabetes. Like I said before, I'm a huge fan of hybrid closed loop systems, but there are some reasons to keep pushing and go even further. The first is the quality of life improvement of not having to worry about your meals, stress about diabetes, think about the disease, etc. And the second is that AID systems with increased automation around meals will offer improved glucose control as well, especially for people who need it the most, who currently have high A1C and low time in range. JDRF is pursuing multiple scientific strategies to get to this goal. One, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, is ultra-rapid insulins. Another is adjunctive therapies, which Courtney will tell you about. These are non-insulin drugs, which can do many different things, one of which is to help manage your mealtime blood sugar so that the algorithm can take care of it without manual intervention. Speaking of algorithms, we're interested in developing more algorithms specifically to allow you not to bolus or announce a meal. We're currently funding 2 clinical trials on this topic. One is with a new algorithm called AIDANet, which is in clinical trials where people are using the algorithm and taking meals, eating meals without manual bolusing, and we're seeing what the blood sugar looks like. And the second is with an algorithm which is already available as the DIY or do-it-yourself AAPS system, and we're seeing how well it can handle meals without a bolus. These and other approaches out there are extremely promising toward our goal of eliminating the need for meal announcements. But what we may see in the end is that it will be a combination of these approaches, insulins, non-insulin drugs, algorithms, and maybe something we haven't even thought of yet, which will help us get there. Now I'm going to tell you about some of the exciting work we're supporting with new insulins. So maybe I should start with a little bit of background. I don't think anyone would disagree with me if I said that the current insulins are life-saving, but they're not good enough. As I mentioned before, most people still aren't hitting recommended glucose targets, and this isn't the fault of the person with type 1, of course. It's the tools that we have available for them, and that's why we need new insulins. The first one, which we support, is a category called URI, or ultra-rapid insulin. When you have to take your insulin 15 minutes or half an hour before a meal, that's because the insulin isn't fast enough. And when you get hypoglycemia several hours after the meal, because the sugar is gone, but you still have insulin in your system, that's because insulin doesn't leave your body fast enough. That's why we support URI, and we want it to be fast on, fast off. The anticipated benefits of a URI are mealtime glucose control, reductions in the hypoglycemia that can come hours after meal, and potentially enabling the kind of device system I was just talking about, where you have an AID system where you don't need to announce meals. JDRF is currently supporting incredibly innovative preclinical URI research, and I'm showing an example of that. People may be wondering, what is this cartoon? What I'm showing is that some of our investigators discovered that there's a certain kind of snail which has evolved an insulin for hunting. Basically, fish swim by, it sprays the insulin at them, and the fish go into a coma, and then the snail eats them. The reason this works is that the insulin is super fast and immediately sends the fish into hypoglycemia, so they're vulnerable to be eaten. Our investigators realize that this ultra-fast snail insulin used for hunting could be a model to inspire an ultra-rapid insulin for use in people with type 1. We've supported these projects up through large animal studies, and what you see on the right side here is indeed a large animal study showing that this insulin in development can rapidly and potently lower blood sugar. Another type of insulin we're supporting is LTI, or liver-targeted insulin. The rationale behind LTI is that we want more physiological insulin delivery. In someone without diabetes, when insulin is secreted from the pancreas, most of it goes straight to the liver which is important because the liver is a key organ for regulating blood sugar, and it needs insulin to do it. However, in people with type 1, the way insulin is administered, whether it's through a pen or a pump, it goes underneath the skin and very little makes it to the liver, and there are clinical consequences to that. The expected benefits of LTI include reduced hypoglycemia, lower glucose spikes after a meal, and metabolic control even beyond glucose. And Courtney will tell you much more about what that means. There are multiple scientific strategies out there to get insulin to the liver. And this is a picture of a model of one product which is being developed called HDV, hepatodirected vesicles, which you can mix with insulin and it'll act like a beacon to get the insulin to the liver. This drug is being developed by Diazome, which is invested in by the T1D Fund, JDRF's venture philanthropy arm. The third and final category of next-gen insulins I'm going to talk about is GRI, which stands for glucose-responsive insulin. This has been a JDRF flagship for some time. This diagram shows conceptually how a GRI can work. The key is representing insulin, and the lock is representing the insulin receptor, the protein that insulin has to bind to in order to lower blood sugar. One way a GRI can work is that when the blood sugar is low, it's bent out of shape. It's made this way. It's made to be inactive by default. However, when blood sugar rises, it straightens out the key, or, in our analogy, changes insulin into its normal shape, and now it can interact with the receptor and lower blood sugar. So you can imagine over the course of day, you have one large injection of GRI, and then with each meal, the insulin turns on to take care of the sugar, and then turns off when you don't need it, avoiding hypoglycemia. We've seen a tremendous amount of progress in this field over the years. JDRF-supported projects have advanced to large animal testing. We've seen collaborations with large companies, including Sanofi and Eli Lilly, in this space. I want to tell you a little bit about a company called Protomar Technologies, which is really sort of the model for JDRF early stage success in this area. Several years ago, we hosted something called the GRI Grand Challenge, where we accepted people's outside the box crazy ideas for how to make a GRI. Again, a drug which at the time, people didn't even know if it would be possible. One of the winners was a young scientist named Alborz Mahdavi. He took the JDRF grant, started working with it, spun out a company called Protomar Technologies, got a couple more JDRF grants to help him build the insulin pipeline. He was successful enough that he then got an investment from the T1D Fund and ultimately was acquired by Eli Lilly. And this story, speaks to one emerging success with an insulin, but also speaks to the value of JDRF in supporting early innovation to de-risk it and get it further along. Today, it's an exciting time in GRI. Novo Nordisk is publicly in clinical trials with their glucose-responsive insulin. And Eli Lilly has announced on their website that they have a phase 1 clinical trial testing a glucose-sensing insulin receptor agonist. And I just have to emphasize that this is a field that JDRF has played a major role in. We've not just funded grants, but hosted workshops, led the discussions, brought the companies on board, found collaborations, and we're going to continue to do what we can do to drive progress forward. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Courtney Acafi, to tell you about some of the exciting work we're doing in non-insulin drugs.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Acafi. I'm a scientist working with John in the Improving Lives group. I'm going to talk to you about adjunctive therapies. So John just talked to you about the next generation of insulins, and we are really excited about that work, but we also know that insulin therapy alone is not enough to achieve optimal glycemic and metabolic control. Adjunctive therapies, or non-insulin therapies, can be used to complement insulin therapy to achieve those glucose targets, improve metabolic control, and lead to the prevention of long-term complications. And we know this is greatly needed. In the United States, up to 70% of people with type 1 do not achieve their glucose targets. 2/3 of adults have overweight or obesity, and still, some people with type 1 must deal with the long-term complications like kidney disease and heart disease. So it's important for us to refocus our management strategy to be more comprehensive and include treating metabolic imbalances like insulin resistance and obesity, and consider cardiorenal health when treating this disease. So our goal is to help drive forward development of new therapies or existing products for the type 1 population, and to influence the clinical guidelines and make these additional therapies part of the standard of care. Clinical development and regulatory approval requires industry sponsorship. And so JDRF works in a few ways to de-risk entering the type 1 space for companies. One way is by working closely with companies to bring their therapies forward for a real type 1 indication. Or we work by driving investigator-led studies to build the body of evidence for therapies' safety and efficacy. And so I'll be describing a couple of those scenarios and some recent initiatives to develop drugs for glucometabolic control for type 1 diabetes. So in type 1, there's too much glucagon at high glucose levels and not enough at low glucose levels. Volixitamab, or Vola, is a novel drug developed by REMD Biotherapeutics. It's a glucagon receptor blocker, and it prevents glucagon action. And in type 1, poor control and too much glucagon causes these blood sugar levels to rise, and this therapy will help lower them. You can see in the graph to my right that a recent 12-week phase 2 clinical trial showed that Vola demonstrated meaningful improvements in A1C and CGM metrics in people with type 1. And you can see in those orange and green lines that there's a clear reduction in A1C. JDRF is supporting multiple studies to understand the efficacy and safety benefits of this therapy. One of these is furthering our understanding of the mechanism and to assess if there are potential metabolic benefits like to insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. JDRF has also recently entered into a direct partnership with REMD to fund a mechanistic safety study. All this work aims to build the body of evidence in people with type 1 so that this therapy can be driven forward towards phase 3 clinical trials. Again, glucagon in people with type 1 is not secreted properly. And so Zuccara Therapeutics is developing ZT-01. It's a once-daily injectable therapy that restores the glucagon release at low blood glucose levels and has the potential to prevent hypoglycemia. JDRF funded Zuccara early in the preclinical stages and to do that translational research prior to their first clinical trial, and has recently just expanded this partnership to launch their phase 2 study, the ZONE study, which will look to assess if ZT-01 has the ability to prevent nocturnal hypoglycemia, and it's recruiting now. As John said earlier, the liver plays a major role in glucose metabolism. Cadozgliatin is a therapy being developed by VTV Therapeutics. It works to improve glucose control by targeting the liver. It's an oral once-daily therapy. And in their clinical trials, you can see on the right, here's some data from their 12-week study, that in the blue line, you see a meaningful decrease in A1C. In the study, there was also a decrease in hypoglycemic events, and this led to an FDA breakthrough therapy designation. JDRF and VTV have partnered for this trial, and has recently in the news, there was a notice that the T1D fund helped bring about a major investment, and VTV is now initiating their phase 3 program. These have all been examples of JDRF collaborations with industry to drive T1D specifically, drug development. Another approach we take to driving T1D development is by funding investigator-led trials dedicated to the type 1 population to evaluate therapies for safety and efficacy. One class of drugs that is everywhere in the news are the GLP-1 receptor agonists like semaglutide. Drugs like Ozempic have had blockbuster success in type 2 diabetes and now as anti-obesity agents. These drugs improve blood glucose by doing a few things. They decrease the glucagon secretion, they slow gastric emptying and decrease your appetite. So you end up with a more comprehensive approach to glucometabolic health. The biggest struggle that people with type 1 that we have is that people with type 1 have been excluded. And so JDRF plays a key role in developing these agents for type 1. We are currently supporting multiple trials with semaglutide to evaluate the potential metabolic and cardiovascular benefits for type 1, for people with type 1. JDRF is taking all shots on goal to better understand the benefits. And with Ozempic, there are so many benefits. There's glycemic control, there's metabolic control, there's treatment of cardiorenal complications. And we are including many type 1 populations so that no person with type 1 will be left behind in this new age of drug development. One such study that we're funding is from Viral Shah. He is conducting a trial to study how studies semaglutide as an adjunctive therapy to hybrid closed loop systems in people with obesity and type 1. And this trial aims to understand the potential glycemic and cardiovascular benefits for this population that's at increased risk of CVD. Another trial out of the University of Birmingham is focused on adolescents and young adults, another population that tends to struggle with their A1C. And this study aims to add semaglutide to insulin therapy to improve glycemic control. We at JDRF believe that a multi-drug approach is the future for type 1 care. Therapies that target hyperglycemia, that have metabolic targets, and that can improve insulin sensitivity and combat obesity are all needed for type 1. We have learned this from type 2 diabetes, that maintaining glucometabolic control and long-term health requires multiple drugs. And so we're trying to push the limits on what could the benefits of multiple therapies be, and how can type 1 care be tailored to the individual. To investigate this further, JDRF is supporting multiple clinical trials to test the benefits of combining these therapies. One such study is led by Dr. Dandona at University of Buffalo to learn how supplementing insulin therapy with Ozempic and SGLT inhibitors can improve glycemic control. This is just one of many studies that we're funding looking at combinatorial approaches to glucometabolic control. We are focused on targeting well-established drugs and drug classes like the Ozempics and the SGLT inhibitors, but we're also looking for new drugs, and that's where those earlier therapies came in. Improving glucometabolic control is key for maintaining long-term health, but it's also maybe key to preventing long-term complications. And so John will be telling you more about the JDRF initiatives to improve the complications treatment for people with type 1.
Hey everyone, it's John again. I'm going to bring us home by talking about complications and then our work in psychosocial therapies. JDRF focuses on 3 long-term complications of type 1. Eye disease, kidney disease, and heart disease. So I always like to start with the good news. The rate of long-term complications in type 1 has been going down. And this is largely due to people adhering to the ABCs of complication prevention: A1C, blood pressure, and cholesterol. But any amount of long-term complications is too much, and we're working hard to develop therapies for people who progress to this point. Diabetic retinopathy is a long-term complication of type 1 that can cause vision loss. Unlike heart and kidney disease, there are multiple very good therapies that are approved in type 1 and have been specifically tested in type 1. However, even these have limitations, including that it's an uncomfortable injection, and because they have costs associated with them, not everyone has access. Additionally, even with the most modern therapies, not everyone responds to it. When it comes to kidney disease, also known as diabetic nephropathy, it's estimated that more than half of people with type 1 may ultimately be affected by it. There are no approved targeted therapies available for type 1 diabetes kidney disease, and I'm going to tell you what we're doing to change that. Finally, cardiovascular disease. This is a long-term complication of type 1 that affects the cause of death ultimately is cardiovascular disease, and that's why we have a special motivation to tackle this complication. There's also a lack of approved targeted therapies with evidence in type 1. First, I'll tell you quickly about some work we're doing for retinopathy medications. So I mentioned that the current standard of care for retinopathy, anti-VEGF drugs, are fantastic and have saved vision in many people, but they have their drawbacks, including that it requires an injection. So we have special interest in developing therapies which are non-invasive, including these two drugs, which can be taken as pills. Z-Flam is an anti-inflammatory drug. It's repurposed from another development path, so we have lots of data showing that it's very safe and it's convenient. We're helping fund an ongoing clinical trial, and there's even evidence that from the literature that it may help the kidney as well as the eye, and so we'll be testing that. This trial is being done in collaboration with our partners at the DRCR Retina Network, NIH, and the manufacturer of the drug. Another trial we're doing is with a medicine called fenofibrate. This is an old generic lipid-lowering medication. In this sense, it's repurposed, meaning it was developed for one therapy and now we're testing it for one indication and now we're testing it for another. It's safe, it's convenient, it's cheap. If fenofibrate indeed can be shown to improve retinopathy, it could transform medical care all over the world. We're currently supporting a definitive clinical trial in collaboration with the DRCR Retina Network, NIH, Roche, and our colleagues at the Helmsley Charitable Trust. When it comes to oral medications for retinopathy, the potential benefits are, of course, protection of vision, which is paramount, and the quality of life. Now I'm going to tell you about some of the work we're doing to tackle heart and kidney disease in type 1. These two often go together in our presentations because they go together in life. I mentioned that cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of mortality in adults with type 1. It's closely associated with nephropathy. So when you tackle one, you also tackle the other. What is frustrating but also presents amazing opportunities is that the field of heart and kidney therapies has undergone transformational changes in the last few years, but not for people with type 1. And I'm going to tell you about how we're trying to grab onto drugs that are transforming outcomes in people with type 2 diabetes and kidney and heart disease and bring that into our community. A couple of years ago, we put out an RFA, once again, going to the field of researchers for their ideas on what therapies we should advance. This was called Clinical Trials to Advance Therapies for Nephropathy, which is kidney disease, and Cardiovascular Disease in Type 1 Diabetes. We got a phenomenal response and are now supporting several trials, testing some expected drugs and some surprising drugs for heart and kidney disease in type 1. We're supporting trials testing 2 repurposed therapies, meaning they were developed for indications unrelated to type 1 diabetes, kidney, and heart disease. One is called acetazolamide, one is called montelukast. They're both generic pills, and we're going to see how well they do for heart and kidney disease. There's another group of drugs that we're testing, which are either approved or in development for heart and kidney disease, but haven't been thoroughly investigated in people with type 1. And so one among these is a generic drug called colchicine. And then there are some on-label drugs, including semaglutide, which is Ozempic, which Courtney already talked about, sotagliflozin, an SGLT inhibitor I'll tell you more about in a little bit, and finally a combination therapy of sotagliflozin, as well as an endothelin receptor antagonist called ambrisentan, which is approved for pulmonary hypertension, but not kidney and heart disease. All clinical trials are important, and probably none more so than pivotal trials. The pivotal trial is the phase 3 trial, which is going to get a regulator like the FDA to approve the drug for your population. In our case, people with type 1 diabetes and heart and kidney disease. To illustrate the gap in care between people with type 1 and people with type 2 for heart and kidney disease, I'm showing this figure from the official clinical practice guidelines. I've drawn boxes around 3 therapies which are transforming care for people with type 2 diabetes, kidney disease, but which aren't yet approved for type 1. One is called GLP-1RA. An example of that kind of drug is semaglutide, and there are others. Then SGLT inhibitors and non-steroidal mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. Our goal is to get these therapies, as well as others, FDA approved for type 1 diabetes. The simple challenge is that they haven't been rigorously tested in people with type 1. People with type 1 weren't in the clinical trials, the pivotal trials that led to their approvals for type 2 diabetes and other populations. The way to drive forward the necessary pivotal trials to get FDA approval for these therapies is through strategic funding, collaboration, and above all, JDRF leadership. We're in a truly exciting time now. In just the last few months, it's been announced that there's not one, but 2 pivotal trials that will be happening for type 1 diabetes, kidney disease. The first one I'll tell you about is being sponsored by the pharmaceutical company Bayer with their drug finerenone. This is a pill which is approved for kidney disease in type 2 diabetes. Bayer is sponsoring a clinical trial, a pivotal phase 3 clinical trial called FINE-1, testing whether this drug can improve kidney disease in type 1 in the same way that it does in type 2. And this trial is recruiting now. The second pivotal trial I want to tell you about, also recently announced, is with a drug called sotagliflozin, an SGLT inhibitor. This is a drug which is FDA approved for heart failure and has strong efficacy for kidney disease in type 2 diabetes. It's also a once daily tablet. The clinical trial, which is called Sugar and Salt, came about as a collaboration between JDRF, the incredibly talented team of academic investigators, Lexicon, the drug manufacturer, and our colleagues at the Kidney Foundation of Canada. This drug, sotagliflozin, has a very interesting backstory when it comes to type 1 diabetes. It was originally pursued for glucose control, where it indeed has benefit, but didn't make it all the way to people with type 1 and approval because it also increases the risk of DKA, which is also seen in other drugs in the SGLT class. This new pivotal trial is going to take careful efficacy and safety data to see what the kidney benefits are and what the risks are when they employ the most stringent monitoring possible for DKA prevention. All in all, I just want to emphasize that I think it's really an exciting time for T1D kidney disease and cardiovascular disease, and some of the trials which are underway now have enormous potential to move the needle for T1D care. Now I'm going to tell you about the work we're doing in the psychosocial realm for type 1. I won't go through all of these statistics, but the point is that a number of mental health issues are more common in people with type 1, whether you're an adult or a child, and that if you have one of these mental health issues, it affects clinical outcomes like HbA1c and others. It's a huge unmet need in our community. JDRF is taking a multi-pronged approach to addressing the problems with psychosocial care in type 1 diabetes. First, we're increasing the number of trained psychosocial professionals. There's very few trained mental health experts who also know about the unique challenges imposed by type 1 diabetes, and we're directly funding fellowships to increase their numbers. Second, we're increasing both the number of psychosocial interventions and improving their implementation so that they actually get to people with type 1. We're specifically focused on developing interventions or therapies for diabetes distress, depression, anxiety, and eating disorders or disordered eatings. I'm going to tell you all about our dedicated psychosocial strategy, but I have to mention that psychosocial research is not siloed here at JDF. It's also integrated into all of our other areas. For example, when we're testing out a new device that we think is going to improve people's happiness and how they're functioning in the world, we'll test it and come away with its impact on their mental health, as well as A1C and things like time and range. These are some of the psychosocial interventions that we're currently trialing in people with type 1 diabetes. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, or apps that let you talk to someone for support remotely, or interventions for sleep, or group therapy, or mindfulness. These are all different approaches, but what they all have in common is they're behavioral health interventions targeted to improve mental health in type 1 diabetes. Much like a drug trial or device trial, we typically support single or multi-site studies where people are given either the therapy under investigation or a control. And then at the end, we see 1, how well it improved the mental health outcomes, and 2, whether those translated into improvements in A1C and other clinical measures. In the newest wave of psychosocial research we're supporting, we're focusing on what's called implementation. This slide shows all the steps that a psychosocial therapy has to go through from basic research to improving outcomes. And what we have found is that there are a number of interventions that are in the middle of this pipeline, which have been shown to be feasible and have some efficacy data, meaning that we know they work in clinical trials. But very few are making it all the way. We're now turning to answer this challenge to implementation science, the study of methods to promote systematic uptake of effective practices into routine care settings. What that means is that just because a therapy works in a clinical trial doesn't mean it'll work in the real world. And right now, our priority is finding therapies that work in trials and moving them to the broader population. In this sense, we're at the leading edge of behavioral health intervention development. Right now, we have an RFA out on the streets, effectiveness and implementation trials to address mental health and type 1 diabetes. The goal is to start with therapies that we know work in clinical trials and fund research to figure out whether and how they work out in the real world. For example, what happens once you go to a new geography than the one where it was originally tested? Or what happens when the people taking the therapy aren't given all the resources that they would in a small clinical trial, but instead have to operate in a crowded, busy medical setting? These are the sorts of questions which implementation studies address. We had very strict eligibility requirements for these proposals. We weren't interested in testing out new interventions. We wanted to get our hands on the interventions that have already been shown to work in trials and get them out in the world and see how they do. These interventions are all focused on the 4 areas of mental health that we support research in, and the projects are going to be coming soon. And I expect that 1 year from now on the next RIV, I'll be able to tell you what came out of this. I want to conclude this presentation by adding a little bit of context for what progress we've made and where we have to go. JDRF has already been improving lives, and we have further to go. You don't have to be so old to remember what T1D care was like before the new innovations in technology. Glucose monitoring was done by finger sticks. For insulin therapy, you had to do multiple daily injections or use a traditional pump. There was precious little for long-term complications and mental health. Now, fortunately, thanks in large part to JDRF and our dedicated colleagues and community and partners, we've come pretty far. People's lives have improved. We have CGMs like Dexcom and Abbott and other manufacturers making these wonderful devices that can measure glucose 24 hours a day and reduce your worry and improve your outcomes. We have new and improved ways of administering insulin, including AID systems that remove so much of the mental burden of type 1 diabetes and also have been shown time and again to improve clinical outcomes. And we have therapies for eye disease, which are highly effective, and we're developing more, as I described, for cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and the mental burden of type 1. Importantly, again, thanks to JDRF and our partners, the approved products in this list are covered by payers so that people can actually use them. So this is what I hope is evidence of how far we've come working together. And now I'm going to show you where we're going. In the future, someone with type 1 diabetes will have transformative new devices for glucose control and DKA prevention, which will offer better outcomes and once again improve quality of life. We're building next generation insulins, including glucose responsive insulins, and the non-insulin therapies that Courtney told you about for glucometabolic control. We're fighting for approved therapies for heart and kidney disease so that no one in the future with type 1 who progresses to a long-term complication won't be able to get the therapy they need. We're fighting for improved retinopathy therapies, which are even more effective and less invasive than the ones we have now. And finally, we want, if someone with type 1 does have depression or anxiety or an eating disorder, for there to be an evidence-based and widely available and affordable treatment for them to use. These are the key takeaways from the presentation. The first is that the IL program supports research to improve health and quality of life for people with type 1 diabetes. Second, we're laser focused on therapy development, and as such, we prioritize clinical trials. One example of this is the implementation trials and psychosocial. Another example is the pivotal trials and long-term complications. In order to get all of these trials done, we're working on fostering a culture of clinical trial participation. You don't have to be a scientist or a doctor to drive forward T1D research. We encourage everyone who's interested to check out the link here and see if there's any clinical trials you may want to participate in. And last, I just want to bring the point home that until everyone with type 1 diabetes has access to a cure, the IL program will keep working to improve the lives of people with type 1 diabetes. Thank you for your attention.